guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Amber Smith. She's a U.S. Army veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, where she served as a combat helicopter pilot. She's also the author of Danger Close, My Epic Journey as a Combat Helicopter Pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Amber, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you.
Where were you born and raised?
White Salmon, Washington. It's a little teeny rural farm town in southern Washington state in the Columbia River Gorge.
Any family history of military service?
Absolutely. I always say that flying is in my blood. My military lineage goes back to World War I. My great-grandfather was in the Army. He was a lieutenant and fought in the Battle of Verdun. Wow. My grandfather was in the Army Air Corps, and he flew planes in World War II between Europe and Northern Africa. He also flew some of the early helicopter prototypes, and then my dad was in the 82nd Airborne in the 60s. He was an infantryman airborne as well, and my mom was a civilian pilot and had her instructor rating as well. So everybody in my family is pilots, and so I did the same thing.
It was genetic, absolutely. So when did you join the service, and why the Army?
So I joined in January of 2003 is when I actually started, but I went in the Warrant Officer Flight Program, so it actually took a significant amount of time to do all the application procedures. So as I mentioned, my family history had a huge influence over my decision to join the military. But after high school, I ended up going to University of Washington, and while I was there, 9/11 happened. So that was definitely one of the contributing factors of why I actually decided to make the decision to serve my country at the time when I felt I could contribute the most with my aviation experiences and background. And so I looked into all the different military programs, and the Army had the Warrant Officer Flight Program that felt like it was perfect fit for me. So I applied and ended up joining in January of 2003.
And then what? Because 2003, we're already in Afghanistan, and we're a couple months away from going to Iraq. So where did they send you at first?
So I went straight into basic training. I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. From there, I went over straight into helicopter flight school, which is at Fort Rucker, Alabama. It was about 14 months start to finish. I ended up graduating in August of 2004. From there, I went to my unit, the 101st Airborne, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I was there for almost a year before we ended up deploying to Iraq in 2005.
So before you joined, did you have any flight experience?
I did. I got my private pilot's license in a fixed-wing aircraft. A little Cessna 150 is a great aircraft to learn how to fly in. I always thought that I would end up becoming a fixed-wing helicopter or a fixed-wing pilot instead of a helicopter pilot. But I went on one 20-minute long flight in a Robinson R-22, a really small little helicopter. And I ended up just falling in love with helicopters. And when I got done with that flight, I was like, helicopters are for me. That's what I want to do. And so I knew I wanted to switch direction and end up becoming a helicopter pilot instead of a fixed-wing pilot.
People say it's really hard to fly a helicopter.
It is a lot of work. Yes, it takes a lot of time to learn how to do it. And then even once you are capable of doing it, it takes you even longer to become good at it.
Why did you love it so much if it's so hard? Maybe that was part of it.
I love a challenge. Yeah. I'm never one to steer clear of a challenge. I love that you go in every single day and you learn something new, and you really learn about yourself and what you're capable of, and you grow every single day as a person when you are a helicopter pilot, because you're constantly having to change and move forward and think ahead of the aircraft, and it's just a really great job to get to do for a while.
One of the focal points of your book is the fact that you flew Kiowa helicopters and the value that they bring to the military. Is that what they had you in pretty quickly, or did you eventually move to that later?
So the way flight school is set up, you basically, there's an OML from your class, and you get to rank your top helicopters 1, 2, 3. There's a story in my book about how I always say that it was fate that I became a Kiowa pilot, because originally I was super bummed because I got placed as a Black Hawk pilot, and I actually went to the first day of Black Hawk school, ground school, and they called my name the very first day of class, and they basically pulled me out of class and this lieutenant came up to me and he was like, sorry, you're not going to become a Black Hawk pilot, you're going to become a Kiowa pilot, because the guy who was in front of me on the OML ended up having a medical emergency, so I moved into the Kiowa slots, and I'm very happy that that happened.
Why do you love it so much? Why that one?
So the Kiowa, I really feel, breeds a different type of pilot based on the mission that we do. So a Kiowa Warrior, it's a light attack reconnaissance helicopter. We carry 50 cal machine gun, 7 high explosive rockets, and then we have the capability of being configured to carry 4 Hellfire missiles. So depending upon what the mission is, you're going to be supporting the ground forces in some role. So I've worked with infantry, Marines, all sorts of NATO forces, Iraqi army, Afghan army, special forces, anybody that's on the ground that needs some sort of aerial cover, we work with them. So Kiowa pilots really pride themselves on being able to be there whenever they can to help the guys who are in the thick of the fight every single day outside the wire. So we take off every day, fly outside the wire, but at the end of our mission block, we go back and land safely inside the wire. So we really like to be able to be there, provide some sort of security and reassurance to the people who are out there with the enemy day in and day out. So our mission set it looks like we cover troops and contacts, basically friendly forces and sustained enemy contact, basically a firefight. We will fly there, find, fix, destroy the enemy if required. We'll also do IED reconnaissance. So we'll look for roadside bombs. Okay. We fly extremely low level. So, sometimes 50 feet above the ground in order to see what is a hazard or a threat to some of our friendly forces. At night, we fly higher just for our own protection as well. But we definitely fly within eyesight of the enemy and vice versa. They can see us very clearly. I always say it's not a matter of if you're ever going to get shot at as a Kiowa, it's when. So it's definitely a dangerous job.
And how big is the crew?
There's only 2 of us. You have a co-pilot and then your pilot in command. And you always fly in a flight of 2, so you're going to have a lead aircraft and a trail aircraft. So one is flying overwatch for the other aircraft.
Structure the communication between the 2 pilots, the 2 choppers, and the ground forces. How does that all get organized so there's not sheer chaos?
So we actually have 4 different radios. So you have an internal frequency that you're talking between the 2 helicopters. You're often talking to higher headquarters as well. And then you have a frequency that you're talking to the ground forces on as well. And then you also have different frequencies that you may talk to, like a common air frequency, but you also have different units that you work with have different frequencies that you are aware of when you take off, and then you can speak to them on whatever the frequency may be. So, but you're always hearing something going on in your ear. It's not ever quiet. If it's quiet, you're like, wait, what's going on? This is a little too quiet. So there's somebody's always talking to somebody, and that's why it's such a handful of, there's always so much going on in terms of having to multitask, all the radios and then everything else that goes along with it.
Sounds like you love that. Flying, communicating, shooting when the time comes.
Yes, you could describe everything we do, and then you say, oh, and then fly a helicopter on top of it. And you're like, I don't know if that sounds safe, but...
So you went to Iraq first, correct?
Yes.
And so you've gone through all this training. What's it like the first time you're actually supporting ground forces and engaging the enemy?
So I was 23 years old when I went to Iraq. I was still a brand new pilot, so to speak, and I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know. I'd seen war movies. I'd heard war stories. But I feel like until you get over there and experience it for yourself, you have really no idea what to expect. So the unknown is always a little fearful. You have in your own head of just wondering what it's going to be like. And I always say Afghanistan was a much harder war, for me at least, but Iraq was harder in terms of me being brand new to my unit, me essentially having to work day in and day out and never letting my guard down and having to essentially prove that I was there for the right reasons and earn everybody's trust. That was extremely challenging. Everybody says that when you go into flight school and then you get to your unit, it's like drinking from a fire hose. And that was true for a couple years for me, Iraq being one of them. But Iraq was probably one of the biggest learning curves that I've ever had in my life, just because of the op tempo and the environment. And so you're still training every single day that you go fly, but it's just real world combat war. So there's not much room for mistakes. And so it's a lot of pressure. But I was also training to become a pilot in command, which I ended up making while I was in Iraq. And it was definitely intense. You know, pilots' sleeping schedules are all over the place. You're constantly reversing out and doing the night shift, doing the day shift, flying very long hours. Some missions, you're just going to be doing reconnaissance and security, which means nothing that deliberate. And then other days you are flying for 6+ hours where you're involved in back-to-back troops in contact, and you're essentially like a fire truck just bouncing from one place to the other with, you know, hot enemy activity.
How well are the helicopters armored since you're so close to the enemy sometimes?
So we had the capabilities of having engine armor. At least my unit removed the engine armor for weight purposes, so we were able to carry more ammo. But in terms of what weapons we had, we carried a 50 cal machine gun. We carried a rocket pod that you could carry 7 rockets, and we had different rocket configurations that we could use. And then we never flew in country in a combat zone with Hellfire missiles, but there are configurations that you can put on the aircraft to do that. And then the pilot's seats have armor. I think it's under the seat that you sit in. So not a lot. And we don't fly with doors either. So. Oh, really? No doors. You got to be able to stick your head out the door and see what's down there.
Go back to what you said a minute ago about the environment, because I remember in an article I read where you talked about trying to get your mind around the military mindset or how the military works. What was hard about adjusting to that in Iraq, especially?
So the military is not a job. It is a lifestyle. And I was high school to flight school. So it's just a phrase. I wasn't literally high school straight into flight school, but it essentially means that I had no prior Army experience, where most warrant officers join the military as enlisted soldiers, and they can be in any job, and then they apply to become a warrant officer and become a helicopter pilot. So they have all of this Army experience. They know how to speak the language. They know the rank structure and the command structure and how you wear your uniform, protocol and procedures that most people who have previously served take for granted in terms of everybody should know that. But when you're brand new to the Army, my experience entails 3 months of basic training. And then suddenly you go into warrant officer candidate school and you're expected to essentially have the same level of expertise and experience as people who have served for years. So I think that was what was challenging for me at first, was just learning all of the information and being proficient at it and actually knowing what I was talking about, and then becoming a helicopter pilot on top of all of the Army information that you have to learn. Then becoming a helicopter pilot and, becoming an expert at your helicopter. That is, it's a challenging time, but like I said, I knew joining the military that it wasn't going to be a cakewalk, that I was going to have to work probably the hardest that I've ever had to work in my life to get to where I was good at my job and was an effective part of the team. And that's where I wanted to be. And I had goals that I set and that I worked towards nonstop. And then once I got through, probably I'd been in my unit for a year, served in Iraq for a year, had some experience under my belt, it slowly but surely became easier and easier, which is probably why I still say today that Afghanistan, it was a harder war, but an easier deployment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Any problems, I guess, how people treated you because you're a female pilot?
I always say that in my book, Danger Close, I tell a few stories where I always leave that up for other people to interpret, because I think that a lot of the struggles that I faced may have had to do with my age as well. I was very young compared to most of the people that I served with. I was the same age as most lieutenants, but everyone else outranked me. So I was at the bottom of the barrel and was pretty young. So most of the men that I served with were at least a decade older than me. And I had a lot to prove when I got there. Believe it or not, in 2004, when I got to my unit, women were still extremely rare. And so I think, I think I was 22 years old when I got to my unit. And I think people didn't really know what I was, if I was going to be able to do the same job that they were able to do, and if I was there for the right reasons, and if they'd be able to trust me. And then it was really just me sticking to my guns in terms of me being who I am, and really focusing on being a good pilot and a good warrant officer. And it took some time, but as soon as everybody saw that I was there for the right reasons and that I could fly the aircraft the same way that they could, and I wasn't going to quit, I guess, I feel like I really earned their trust and became an effective part of the team.
Sticking to your guns, literally and figuratively, right?
Yeah.
So what's it like being a Kiowa pilot supporting ground troops in an urban environment? In Afghanistan, which we'll get to in a minute, it's very different, obviously, most of the time. So how often did that happen, first of all, and what are some of the challenges that go along with that?
Well, in an urban setting, it's challenging. You have the enemy that blends in with the civilian population, which makes it extremely challenging. But Kiowa pilots learn the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the enemy. You're there for a significant amount of time. When I was deploying, we would go for about a year. And you get to learn the way the civilian population operates just on a daily basis. How they're walking down the street, how they're driving their cars, things to look for that should be sitting on the street, that shouldn't be sitting on the street, different times of day, what dead animals on the side of the street look like, what wires sticking out of a culvert look like. So you really get to learn the population that you're flying above, you could say. But an urban setting is very difficult because of the buildings, and people can run in and out, and even at night, the enemy gets to learn our TTPs as well. And when we fly overhead, or sometimes when they would hear the rotor systems, you would see entire cities go dark because they would shut off the power to cities to sort of communicate with each other. And it was absolutely a challenge. But they also did some things that weren't very smart, which made it easier on us as well. So,
you want to elaborate on that?
Mostly, I would say with IED emplacement. Were them thinking that we can't see them, which we could. So I always say, if a helicopter sees someone on the ground, you're unless you're able to run into some sort of building and the helicopter loses sight of you, you're in a bad place if a helicopter sees you.
All right, let's move to Afghanistan now, and obviously less urban fighting, but you've got terrain issues there. Was that the biggest problem, or were other things bigger?
So it was, I would say, a more experienced and a more willing to fight. The enemy there was more willing to fight. They weren't as timid and everybody has their own different experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan based on where they were and maybe what they were flying or on the ground, whatever. But at least initially when we got to Afghanistan, the enemy wasn't as worried about us. So oftentimes in Iraq, the enemy, once we came on station or they knew we were in the AO, they would sort of cease operations till we would leave. In Afghanistan, they were fine with shooting at us, maybe in an attempt to make us leave, but they weren't scared of us at all. And they were just much more willing to fight. And the enemy there knew the terrain so well. And it's an impossible terrain. They often were up on the higher ground, which is where we would fly, just for security purposes. You know, we don't fly low in the valleys, just because you don't want to be, from an enemy perspective, able to have them be like shoot down on you. But there were, in terms of environmental hazards, they were much more extreme in Afghanistan than they were in Iraq, with the mountains, with the weather, and the altitude as well. So it was a challenge, and at least I think when my unit went over there, we probably only had two pilots who had been to Afghanistan before. So we were a brand new unit, brand new set of pilots to Afghanistan. So we were all fairly new to what extreme mountain flying was actually like. And there's all sorts of different wind gusts and things that mess with you if you're flying too close to a mountain, or your power management, how you land or take off, and different weight settings and different power management. So flying in Afghanistan was a challenge, but it was also probably the most amazing flying I ever did as well.
What's the ceiling on how high you can go in the Kiowa?
So it depends on your division or your brigade. We had a ceiling of 6,000, I do believe, when I was there. Our helicopters could go much higher. I know the unit that replaced us, they had that lifted, so they were able to fly higher. I think just because we were the first Kiowa unit there in a while, they wanted to make sure we were able to properly power manage the aircraft, and we didn't have any issues. So I think they decided that we could go a little bit higher, which you needed to because of where friendly forces were operating. They were often higher than that. So
I'm guessing because the Kiowa is smaller, it's a little more agile than some of the other helicopters. So when you're in close and you've got enemy firing on you, whether it's with rifles or maybe even a shoulder-fired missile, what goes through your mind? How do you evade when you see that they're going after you?
Well, you have one more thing to think about, which is the hazard of a mountain that's, maybe sometimes on three sides of you. So we are at an advantage of being small with the Kiowa. We are able to maneuver a little bit better and get down into it a little bit more than, say, an Apache, just because of our size. So you just have to constantly be thinking ahead of time. If you're going to put your aircraft in a situation, you have to have contingency plans and know how you're going to respond when you do start getting shot at or something like that. So you always have to be thinking ahead of the aircraft.
Did you have a lot of moments where you were wondering if we're going to get out of this, or does that not even enter your mind because you're already thinking of your...
I did. No, absolutely. Especially, you don't ever really think about it in the moment. You can't. You have too much going on. It wouldn't be safe or smart for anyone to have that thought in the moment. But afterwards, when you go back, and I don't even say... Yes, when you go back to the FOB and you land, you do think about it. But sometimes I think it's even much later when you're like, how was I was flying too slow. I was flying too close, and then this happened. How on earth did I survive that? You have ground guys telling you, even if sometimes you don't see it, hear it, you have ground guys telling you, like, you're taking fire, stuff like that over the radio. At night, it's much easier. You can see tracer rounds, so it's much easier to see it if it's not a direct hit to your aircraft. But yeah, absolutely. In Iraq, I did have a couple direct hits to my helicopter as well. But it's crazy to think about.
Do you generally fly with the same co-pilot every time?
So it depends. I feel like it starts that way, and then we fly with them for a couple months, and then people start rotating with R&R schedules, and so things start changing up.
You just touched on this a little bit, but the adrenaline rush,
mm-hmm.
How do you learn to channel that? Is it fairly instinctive, or ultimately do you have to be taught how to channel that?
So I think it's more instinctive. I wouldn't say I was ever taught how to do it, but I remember one of the pilots that I flew with in Iraq, he had been in Iraq during the invasion in 2003 when I was still in flight school. And he said, I remember after the first time we got shot at, and I was actually flying with him. I had a AK-47 round land about 12 inches behind my seat. He was like, that's the biggest rush you're ever going to have in your entire life. And obviously it's not a positive one, but it's absolutely true until you have someone that is, literally trying to kill you and you walk away from it. It's a crazy experience, but you really do have to push it out of your mind. Otherwise, I don't think you'd be able to operate. And then, the next day you take off and go flying and do a mission and know that the same exact thing or worse could happen. But you just do the best every day to make sure that you and your crew are being safe and that you're able to handle the situation when it happens.
How long did you stay in the Army after you returned from Afghanistan?
So as a whole, I was in for, I think, 7 years and 8 months. And when did I get home from Afghanistan? I was in for about a year and 9 months after I got home.
And what did you do during that time?
So I went to JRTC for probably like the third time, maybe the fourth time, which is down in Louisiana. It's like essentially a month-long course to train you up for deployment. And then during the height, I guess, of both wars, when we were still deploying, year on, year off, which my unit was, we were on the deployment schedule to go back to Afghanistan about 15 months after we got home when I did. So you're training nonstop. You sort of hit the ground running. Everybody thinks you're going to get a break when you get home, and instead it's sort of the exact opposite. All you do is train nonstop. And I remember some of our instructor pilots would be like, I just want to deploy so I can take a break, which is a break from all of the stuff that the Army shoves on top of you when you're at home in America. So nonstop training is what we did.
Well,
lots of flight hours, and time on the flight schedule.
Well, you're a civilian again now, but you did spend some time working at the Pentagon under Secretary Mattis. What was your job there, and what did you think of it? So
I was the Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Outreach. So it was half of public affairs at the Pentagon. And it was an amazing experience to see the military and the Department of Defense at an extremely 180 different than what I had experienced as a soldier, as a pilot in the Army. So it was an amazing experience. I'm so happy I got to do it. Getting to work for Secretary Mattis was incredible.
And up to the reputation?
Yeah, I think he's one of the greatest leaders of our time. Yeah. And it was surreal to get to be there, but fantastic to get to serve again in a completely different capacity this time. But yeah, I'm really thankful for my time in the Army and then my time up at the Pentagon as well.
And finally, what are you doing now?
Now I'm running a strategic advisory and communications firm called Beacon Rock Strategies and enjoying life out in the civilian world.
Well, you've certainly earned it.
Thank you.
Your time in uniform is a great credit to our country, so thank you so much for your service, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Amber Smith, U.S. Army veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, where she served as a Kiowa combat helicopter pilot. Her book is Danger Close, My Epic Journey as a Combat Helicopter Pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.